just show that's better. Yeah. So we're starting in May 1939. This is my mother on the right, called Ruth, and her brother Raymond, my uncle. And in May 1939, she and he came to England, leaving their parents behind on the railway platform in Munich, and they never saw them again. That was because of the Nazi persecution of the Jews. Yet my mother and uncle were baptized as Protestants. And it's during the 1930s that what had been a very comfortable world for them suddenly fell apart. And this is the story of what happened. So here are my mother's family in about 1929, 10 years before the war broke out. On the left there is Hans Neumeyer, who's my grandfather. He was actually blind, a blind musician who taught music and composed and wrote about counterpoint theory. Vera on the right is his wife, who's 6 years younger, and she was also a teacher, but she taught some sort of dance improvisation called eurythmics, and particularly works on children, teaching them. And at the front there, boy at the front is Raymond, aged about 4, who's my uncle, and the left, my mother Ruth, aged about 6. And note there's a teddy bear. She's got a teddy bear which has a twist in the story, and if you keep that in mind, there's a twist in the story right at the end. But there they are, having tea in a peaceful situation in their garden in southern Germany. And the place they lived in southern Germany, it might surprise you, it's a town called Dachau, which then in 1929 would have been a pretty peaceful place. My mother was born 6 years earlier, 1923, 10 years before the Nazis came to power. And Dachau then was a peaceful little town. Of course, it's known now today as the first concentration camp the Nazis opened in 1933. But then it was a peaceful town with a castle just north of Munich, and it was known primarily as a place for artists. It had quite an artist colony there. And this is the house my mother was brought up in. It was a rather lovely gingerbread house. She's very, very fond of it. And that's her standing on the steps, aged about 6, in 1929, I think. And that's her mother, Vera, next to it. She remembered this house very well and wrote a letter later on to the man who took over the house and turned it into flats, because it still stands today. And she described it in huge detail, but she mentioned, for example, in the hallway was a beautiful old peasant cupboard, greeny blue, painted with sheep scenes. And opposite the stairs, the door led to a large studio with a grand piano. And in that room, there was lots of family life took place. And it was my grandmother's music and dance classes took place in that room. And she also organised theatre performances, which the children did all year round. So first with my grandfather, Hans Neumeyer, born in 1887. That's him aged about 1, taken as a studio portrait. He was born with an eye defect, so he was blind in 1 eye when he was born. And with terrible luck, when he was about 13, a boy at school, they had some sort of struggle at school, fell over or had a fight or something. And as a result, he lost the sight of the other eye. So he was totally blind by then. His father, Nathan Neumeyer, ran this textile shop clothing shop in Munich. That's an advert for it on the right on that stamp. And in the upper story windows, you can see the whole family there looking out of the window, and that tiny little person there on the floor, but one from the top, and that's Hans, as aged about 6, I should think. So there's probably sometime in the 1890s. And next to him is his sister, Irma, the older sister. It's the only known picture we have of his sister. So being blind, not a lot of options are open to him, but he decided to study music. And it soon emerged that he had a great gift for improvising and composing counterpoint and theory, and had an amazing musical ear. And at the age of 17, he is accepted into the Royal Academy of Music in Munich. And he's seen here on the right with a group of his pupils later in life. My grandmother, Vera, born as Vera Ephraim, born in 1893 in a town called Görlitz. She's the youngest of 4 children, 3 girls and 1 boy. And all the others survived the war. She didn't, but all the others managed to survive. Her parents, Martin and Hildegard Ephraim, were very rich people. Her father was a Jewish industrialist who ran a big factory in this town, Görlitz, and made a lot of money out of it, which made railway components. And he endowed lots of buildings and art projects in town. He endowed a music festival and an industrial competition, and they built a wonderful railway station there, and put money towards building the synagogue, which is on top right there, and as well as endowing a wonderful museum, which is there as well. So he's a really big cheese in town, and he was patriotic German, very much bestowed with honours by the town. So Vera, my grandmother, met my grandfather at a place called Hellerau in 1911, which is Hellerau was a school for learning eurythmics, this special dance rhythm method, which you can see my grandmother practicing up on the top right there, and she appears in the bottom middle row there, along with other girls who are studying, and they met there. My grandfather was playing the piano and teaching there, and one of the people he taught and they met together was a Quaker English woman. She's called Beatrice Eckard, and 28 years later, Beatrice Eckard proved to be the children's salvation when she and her husband, Frank, let them come and live with their extended family in England. And that was just 4 months before the war broke out. And if that meeting between Beatrice Eckard and my grandparents hadn't happened in 1911, then I probably wouldn't be here talking to you now. My mother used to show me photos of her family life in Dachau in the 1920s and 30s. She had this huge photo album with 600 pictures in it. And it all looked very idyllic, lots of playing, going for walks, and lots of friends. Her mother took lots of the photos and developed them herself in a dark room in the house. And they seemed to be a very happy family, lots of nice people around them. But though lovely those pictures are, they always, to me, have an air of sadness, as the family just didn't know what was about to happen to them. And being Protestant, being Jewish played no part in their lives at all. That's them in the mountains there. My grandparents and Ruth and Raymond, my mother and uncle. Now, my grandmother's, this is a picture of my grandmother running a eurythmics class with her children locally. Raymond, my uncle, is the first person on the left there, and my mother Ruth is there, the girl with plaits, 4 from the end. That was probably taken about 1930. My mother looks about 6 or 7, and Raymond was just over a year and a half earlier, younger. And I'm going to play you a clip of one of several clips I'm going to play in this presentation of my mother talking about her experiences. And she's describing this sort of eurythmics exercises and the sort of thing her mother did with her. This comes from an interview she made with the Imperial War Museum when she's aged about 80, which is more or less the age she was in that photograph on the top left.
My mother was very keen for us to join her classes in eurythmics. She gave many classes, quite a few in our house, for adults and for children. She went to various schools and convent schools to teach the nuns how to do eurythmics with young children. And she organized plays in our house once a year, around about Christmas time. And a lot of children from our school or from her classes took part in this.
might notice there's a slight German accent there, but it's quite hard. It's quite hard to spot it in a way. So her school days in Dachau, she would have gone presumably in the late 1920s to school. This is a picture dates from 1930 when she was 7. She's there in the front row with plaits and a white dress, third from the right and the bottom. And their parents didn't have enough money to send them to the grammar school in Munich, so they went to the what's called the Kloster School in Dachau, which run by nuns as teachers. And you can see the nun at the back there. They had to write very neatly and copy lots of pictures like this one, Unser Frühstück, our breakfast. So she's done this little drawing, Ruth Neumeyer, underneath. And some children became very good friends, but they didn't really learn very much when they're at school. They had to write in this very precise, controlled handwriting, which she didn't like doing at all. And when she came to England, she changed her handwriting style completely. Both her and her brother Raymond felt they missed out on education later in life, and they really wanted to make up for it later on. Then in 1933, Adolf Hitler was appointed Chancellor of Germany, and in March 1933, the Nazis won the election outright, with Hitler as its leader, and Germany now becoming a one-party state or a dictatorship. And as you can see from this picture, he is adored by many people as someone who could turn Germany's fortunes around and make it a great power after it had such a bad time after the First World War. And we'll know that Hitler hated Jews and immediately introduced laws preventing Jews from working. Now this affected my grandparents immediately, because my grandfather had just taken up a position as teacher in the Academy of Music in Munich, but he wasn't allowed to. The Nazis forbade him from doing that. So they are struggling immediately with money, and he had to do private teaching.
I think that it was the sort of time when parents really kept children innocent, and they didn't really share their troubles, not like Anne Frank, who always knew the troubles of all the adults, but we were rather sheltered. Our mother always tried to do beautiful things with us, like plays and all these dances and outings to the mountains and that kind of thing.
Yes, Dachau town was then a quiet place, not much evidence of unrest. And life became worse, but the Neumeyer family thought nothing terrible would happen to them, as they weren't really Jewish or well off or important. And then on the other side of town from them, Dachau concentration camp was set up in 1933, and the Nazis put people in there who they didn't like. They could be political opponents, Jews, homosexuals, gypsies and others, and they were slung in there with no trial and treated very, very badly. She only occasionally went through near this camp.
But when you went for walks and you got anywhere near this camp, nobody said anything. They said it was a powder factory and some people get sent there. Nobody spoke about it. But one knew there was something sinister behind those walls. But it didn't really start to be really awful until much later.
And in 1935, September 35, the annual party rally held in Nuremberg, the Nazis announced new laws known as the Nuremberg Laws. These excluded German Jews from Reich citizenship and deprived Jews of a lot of political rights. And the important thing is that you didn't have to hold Jewish religious beliefs to be a Jew under these laws. Instead, anyone who had 3 or 4 Jewish grandparents was defined as a Jew, regardless of whether that person identified himself or herself as a Jew or belonged to any part of the Jewish religious community. And even people with Jewish grandparents who converted to Christianity were defined as Jews. And other laws were gradually introduced from 1933, depriving Jews of their rights, which affected my mother's family in various ways. But they had no connections with Judaism, but meanwhile, the non-Jewish girls, for example, would be joining the BDM, the League of German Girls, and the boys joined the Hitler Youth organizations, which indoctrinated children with Nazi ideology. And at school, she was singled out for being not Jewish, but for being Protestant.
Most of the people in our class were Catholics, and there were only 4 Protestants. So we were always sent out when there's religious instructions. We didn't actually know that we had some Jewish background until we were 12 or something like that. When all these, the BDM and the Hitler Youth started, and they sort of say, well, why don't you come? And Mother said, well, of course you can't.
So those are the rules. Anyone with 3 or more grandparents defined as fully Jewish. So in our case, my mother and uncle had 3 Jewish grandparents. They were therefore fully Jewish and in great danger. My grandfather had 4, and he was obviously Jewish. And my grandmother only had 2. So she was Mischling. She was this halfway case, a mixed race. But she'd married a Jew. They divorced in 1941. That was a year before she was deported. Now, why she got deported but her sisters didn't get deported is a bit of a mystery. We don't know why. But that's the way it ended up. My grandmother and the children went to a Protestant church in Dachau. My grandfather wasn't actually religious, although he was Jewish by race. And he was now reduced to teaching private pupils. He had to give up his guide dog under the Nazi laws. The family weren't allowed to go to things like the swimming pool, and money became pretty hard, pretty hard thing for them to find. When they went out, the children, my mother and uncle, suddenly find other children threw stones at them. That didn't happen before. They threw stones at them and shouted "Zau Jude," which means Jewish pig. And eventually, this is a story which came from a school friend of my mother's. My mother came so afraid that when they were in their house together and there was a knock on the door, my mother would hide herself away in a cupboard. But it wasn't just Jewish people who were scared. They had very good friends who helped them out a lot with food and other things. And one family called the Steurers wrote to my mother just after the war saying how bad things were for them as basically Aryans who weren't threatened by the Nazis, but things were still pretty bad.
You had to be very careful what you said because there were spies everywhere. How often we heard we mustn't win the war because otherwise these murderers would kill us all. Anyone might end up in a concentration camp. You didn't have to do a lot to get in there. Even parents became scared of their own children.
So my grandmother, throughout the 20s and 30s, used to organise these rather beautiful plays for her children and her friends to perform in her house. And there are lots of pictures in their photo albums of these plays, beautifully dressed up and well directed by the looks of it. And while they were performing a play in front of parents in 1937, their childhood dramatically came to an end. These pictures here, you see my mother Ruth on the bottom left. She's standing up there, and she's also appearing there on the left of that picture, and my uncle Raymond's there with little toy sheep. But this is what happens in 1937.
We did a very lovely nativity play round about 1936, which attracted a lot of attention. But on another occasion, probably about a year later, we had a different sort of play, and everything was ready. We had about 40 people watching and about 15 children in the play, when we heard the doorbell, and up came 2 SS people who shouted at everybody how they dared to go into the house of a Jew, and took all their names down and addresses, and the children all cried and all were sent home. And a sort of an uncle of mine who was helping us was taken, sent to prison, and that was really the end of our plays.
Yes, that uncle, a chap called Julius Cohen, was actually a lodger who's a very close friend of theirs, a very gentle man, but he was Jewish. He was taken away for 2 weeks at the Dachau concentration camp, and then in 1943 he was deported to Auschwitz, where he presumably perished. I haven't heard any more. Meanwhile, at school, things were getting worse as well. The teachers told other children not to be friendly with my mother and uncle. My mother had to write under a picture of German soldiers, for example, here, Deutsche sein ist or heißt Kämpfer sein. To be German means to be a fighter. And on the right, that depicts a semblance of a drawing my uncle might have had to do of a green snake with the words, Jews feed on lies and consumed by the truth. So they're children told to do this drawing. My uncle never did it. My grandmother then decided she would take the children out of school and teach them at home instead. So 1938, things were pretty bleak, but my grandparents were obviously trying to make life happy and normal for the children as much as they could. In East 1938, my mother was confirmed as a Protestant at this tiny little Lutheran church in Dachau at the age of 14. That's her confirmation photograph. And there were lots of confirmation cards from friends and relatives wishing all the best for the confirmation. But there was another girl who was due to come to the confirmation at the same time, and confirmed at the same time, from an Aryan family. But when the parents found out that a Jew was going to be in the same room, they refused to have a child having anything to do with it and withdrew that child immediately. And then the very last thing, the very last nice thing they had in their childhood, in summer 1938, they all went on a last summer holiday together in Italy. And it's like the sun shining on the family at the very last time. And after that, things just went downhill. Weeks after they came home from holiday, there were terrible purges against Jews, and Jewish shops all over Germany in what's known as Kristallnacht, the nice broken glass, when windows were smashed and houses were raided and people were beaten up and books were burnt. However, that night in November, it was actually quiet in Dachau, and the night before was when things happened. And what happened here is the Nazis had devised this list, which you see on the left here. It's actually 12 people. I've just put the top 7 there. Number 4 is my grandparents, and these are the lists of Jewish people who live in Dachau and who were going to be thrown out of their houses that night. So here we are, number 4, Neumeyer Johann, that's my grandfather, music teacher. And it says at the end, und zwei Kinder, someone scribbled it in, and 2 children, in other words. So they make sure they don't forget the children, get rid of them as well. So what they did, rather than anything else, or rather than destroying their house or anything, it was just simply to chuck them out. They'd lived 18 years in this community, and they're being kicked out, losing their home and all its contents. And the next day, Dachau proudly announced on the right there, Dachau ist somit judenfrei, which means Dachau is hereby free of Jews.
We had just come back from a holiday in Italy. My father was in Berlin learning how to make flutes, and my mother and the 2 of us were alone in the house when about 8 o'clock, 2 people from Dachau town hall, I suppose, from the burgomaster, arrived to say we would have to leave our house by sunrise the next morning or else be sent to prison. So my poor mother, of course, didn't know what to do. We went to our vicar, the Protestant vicar, asked him for some help, but he said he didn't know what he could do for us, but better just go. So we just packed a case and left before sunrise and went to Munich, to the station there.
And when they got to the station, my grandmother remembered she had some pupils in Munich, and she arranged to stay in their attic for a bit. And they stayed in various attics before ending up in the apartment of a Jewish doctor this photograph here. He's called Dr. Kerbner. And here they are celebrating Lent Carnival inside the Kerbner's apartment. They're probably too terrified to go outside. It probably wasn't safe. But they always celebrated this Lent Carnival, and it was important to them. But they obviously, there's a lot of stress there. My mother's on the right there with a balloon, and my uncle's in the middle hiding behind another child. These are the Kerbner's children, the rest of them. There's Dr. Kerbner at the back with his top hat, and rather miserable looking Frau Kerbner at the front. And I don't know what happened to the Kerbners, but I don't think they got out of Germany. And it was in 1939, early 39, that my grandparents realized that they really were in great danger, and that the best option would be to try to get out of the country. And now, since November 38, when they had the Kristallnacht, the British government had started allowing children under 17 to come unaccompanied on this so-called Kindertransport, the children's transport, providing they had somebody in this country who could pay the £50 guarantee that would be looked after. My mother was at that stage 15, and my uncle was 14. Now, we go back to this story I told you earlier, that my grandparents had met this English woman, Beatrice Paish, while they were studying in 1911. And my grandmother remembered this person and wrote to them in her very good English, asking if they could possibly take their children. And to her joy, Beatrice Paish, as she was now, she was Beatrice Eckard originally, but Beatrice Paish replied that would be very pleased to take the children. And my grandmother wrote back in her very good English, which she'd learnt at school in England many years before, and had probably taught the children some of the language as well. Things would have been pretty complicated, though, for my grandparents. At the age of 45, my grandmother was almost too old to apply to come to England, because no married women were allowed at that age. And she tried to get an exception because her husband was blind. And this nearly worked. They actually were given a place at the blind school in Leatherhead, but they couldn't get the paperwork to get over there in the end.
We accept the noble-hearted offer of your brother and your sister-in-law with joyful relief. The contents of your last letter came to us as a light sent by God through the hopeless dark of the night around us. All we can do is to stretch out our hands to you, dear Mrs. Paish, as well as to your brother and his wife, to thank you and to pray to God that he may reward you for all your kindness.
Then a date was set. The children would depart at midnight from Munich's main railway station. The date was 9th of May, 1939. It's part of this Kindertransport, which brought some 9,300, mostly Jewish children from Nazi-controlled Europe to Britain. These pictures show my uncle's identity photo and the actual cases they took with them. He's showing his right ear. My mother in the audio extract says left ear, but she got that slightly wrong.
We got our different papers, which took ages to get, lots of queuing up in offices, and then your passport, and then you had to take a photograph with your left ear with one of the ears showing. And we had to have everything we wanted to take out of the country displayed. One evening, some official came to have a look to make quite sure we weren't taking too much out of the country.
So those suitcases, they still have the remnants of the luggage labels from that Kindertransport, something I only noticed a couple of years ago. And the man who looked through all their possessions to make sure they weren't taking anything valuable, he missed a few tricks, actually, which is rather nice. They're allowed to take 2 knives, 2 forks and 2 spoons. So they took the best family engraved silver cutlery with the initials of her grandparents engraved on the handles there. And we still have those. And my grandmother had also bought a brand new dressing gown, which probably wasn't allowed either, But when the man came, she put it in the bath and pretended it was an old one being washed out, and they got away with that as well. And then 10th of May 1939 was the actual date of the sailing from Holland to England. And this is the actual ferry ticket my mother had here, 10th of May, on the SS Amsterdam. And that ship there, that is the actual Amsterdam itself they sailed on. And here she is describing what happened.
We were allowed to take a trunk and a case each. Where we were just told we are going on this train, which will go to Holland, and from Holland to England, and then your new people will be collecting you at Liverpool Street, which of course happened. Now, the night we were leaving, we were sort of feeling very mixed, of course, and sad in a way. In the middle of the night, it's always worse. And our parents were allowed to come to the station. We were woken up once by some SAS officials who wanted to look at our papers. And we thought, well, probably something awful was going to happen, but nothing happened, luckily. And in the morning, of course, we arrived in Holland. We were greeted with cocoa and white bread, which was most unusual. Then, I can't really remember the ship at all, but we must have gone on a boat to Harwich and arrived there in the afternoon and down by train to Liverpool Street and waited in the hall there to be collected.
The thing about white bread is quite interesting. A lot of people on the Kindertransport mention this thing about white bread. It's obviously strongly entrenched in their memories that in large parts of Europe you'd only have brown or black bread. But it's strange, that little detail that's come across so well. This is the actual journey. I managed to reconstruct it by finding references to other children who are on the same transport. That they left from Munich at midnight. Only 4 of them on the train. 2 of them were good friends of theirs, who I've also managed to track down quite recently through correspondence. And they went up through Mannheim, Frankfurt, Cologne, crossed the border at a place called Emmerich, and got to the Hook of Holland. And according to one of the children on that transport, it said when they got on the boat, everybody cheered. They got across to Harwich, and when they got into the carriage, the windows of the train were open, and there were men outside on the track throwing sweets into the train. They then got down to London, and there the Paches, Frank and B. Page, were there to meet them, and they drove them to a relative's house in Weybridge. So 11th of May 1939 is a new life in England, and they were greeted by the Page family with a huge meal and immediately made to feel very, very welcome. According to one of them I spoke to quite recently, he said that my mother was wearing a dirndl and my uncle was in lederhosen, so looking very, very Bavarian. And that's their first day in England. And on the 11th of day, in their diary there, she's written Ankunft in Weybridge, which means arrival in Weybridge. And underneath on Friday, the first English word in the entire diary, cornflakes.
My brother went to a different family, but the people where we stayed in Weybridge were relations of the pupil of my father's. And we were there. My brother went to a different school, and I went to the Hall School, which was a wonderful private school in Weybridge. This is the first time I ever enjoyed being in a school. Mrs. Page was very nice. She came and sat on my bed, and she said, "Oh, it won't be long, and your parents will be all right, and we shall look after you." And yes, we were comforted, and we were at the time when lots of new impressions come into your life. Everything very positive.
Use from the parents in Germany was only through letters, and letters were very important. It was the only way of knowing really that the family was okay in the days long before international phone calls were possible, and of course no emails then either. My grandmother wrote most of the letters from Germany, and my grandfather, being blind, typed his letters, and the children wrote back. my mother happily kept all her parents' letters, and I can see that they wrote twice a week from Germany to England and vice versa. Parents were still hoping in July 1939, still hoping to get to England somehow, and desperately trying to find money and fill in paperwork and so on. The post arrived very fast from Germany to England and from England to Germany, sometimes arriving the same day. But then on the 3rd of September 1939, which is Vera's 46th birthday, my grandmother's 46th birthday, letters were no longer able to be sent as war broke out between Germany and Britain. So instead they sent them via a friend in Switzerland, which was neutral and hadn't joined the war. But after that date, of course, it was no longer possible to get out of Germany. In Easter 1940, my mother sent a letter to her parents saying that she and her friend Jane were enjoying playing the recorders together under some fruit trees in their garden. So my grandfather composed 2 recorded duets for children and sent them to them. And these little childish duets arrived with a picture drawn by my grandmother on the cover of the 2 girls playing recorders in a hammock. And it's a lovely imagined scene of a daughter she'd never see again. It's now on display in the Imperial War Museum, and the staff there say it's one of their favourite exhibits in the entire museum. Here's just a tiny snatch of the music. During 1940, mail couldn't be sent any longer, even through Switzerland. Instead, all you could do was send a short message, 25 words maximum, through the Red Cross. And you could only do that once a month. Censors read the messages and they took months to arrive. Anything sensitive wasn't allowed. So they were just very bland, simple messages, and you couldn't really exchange news. An example being, all well, glad having got your news. Mother teaches, father composes, all friends and relatives send greetings. That's kind of all they ever heard. And in 1940, my mother and uncle went their separate ways. My mother went to Cambridge to stay with another part of the family. And then after that, she did nursery training, after which she worked in a nursery in Cambridge, looking after the children who are out in the day doing essential war work. They're regarded still as enemy aliens, and if they left Cambridge, she left Cambridge, she'd have to go somewhere else, stay somewhere else. She had to register with the police. But she made friends, although the threat of invasion at that time was very real, and if it happened, their lives would be in great danger. But there was a big refugee community in Cambridge, and she made friends with them. For example, these women on the left are around her, Laura and Erica Weiss, and she's standing in the middle there. They were refugees from Vienna. I think this stage, I think my mother drew something of a line under her life under the Nazis. Perhaps everything's just too ghastly to contemplate what was happening. I think she's still had the parents very much in the back of her mind, but her gregarious nature made it very easy for her to win friends. And so I think she carried on with life as normal as she could. And on the 8th of May in 1945, she celebrated VE Day with great enthusiasm like everyone else. 1943, my uncle Raymond joined the British Army. He's at the age of 18. As soon as he's 18, he signed up. They used his knowledge of German to work as an interpreter for the intelligence corps and the military police, eventually in Brussels, and then actually in Germany from 1945 to 47. He had to change his name to an English one in case the Nazis caught him. So he changed it from Raymond Neumeyer to Raymond Newland. And Raymond was very aggrieved about his lack of education, and felt he must pass his exams. So he did a lot of studying in the evenings. And in contrast with my mother, he was always furious about what had happened to his family. And tragically, at the end of his life, when he was in his 80s, he was suffering dementia, and his wife found him walked out into the street more than at least on one occasion. And when she went out there, he said, "Oh, I'm going back to Dachau. I need to rescue my parents." So throughout the war, there was this worry about what had happened to their parents, particularly with my uncle, but my mother obviously had at the back of her mind as well. And only after the war ended in 1945, they found both their parents had been murdered in Nazi camps. And my grandmother on the left, aged 48, and my grandfather, aged 56. And those photos are from their Nazi identification papers, and they're the last pictures we have of them, looking rather thin. My grandmother was taken to somewhere on the 13th of July 1942. We don't know where it was, but the records seem to suggest that it was a train going to Auschwitz, the biggest of the extermination camps, so it may have ended up in Warsaw. She travelled in an ordinary third class train like this one, wasn't a cattle truck. And she didn't know where she's going. She's taken in a lorry to Munich station for deportation. And she wrote a letter while she's on this train, describing the people on the train and the places they're going through, which has helped me construct quite a lot of the route. And miraculously, that letter she wrote on the train got delivered, and we have the text of it. We're going to hear a couple of passages of it read out now.
Yesterday morning we had to get up at 5 o'clock in Munich, and shortly after 7 o'clock we sat in the lorry, which was not as dark and the air not as filthy inside as I had expected. All the luggage was taken care of. At the goods train station, a third-class carriage was waiting for us. I soon became acquainted with the other 6 fellow travellers, and something like a feeling of community began to develop through the entire travelling ensemble. The group grew as people joined at Regensburg and Dresden. In Dresden, we suddenly had to change carriages, which was the nuisance, as we had just made ourselves comfortable for the night, and in the hurry and darkness we had trouble finding our belongings. This morning at 6 o'clock we came through Görlitz, and there I saw our house. Now we're travelling through meadows and fields. The woman from Poland lying next to me says it looks like this in Poland too. The mood isn't bad. I experience again an atmosphere of bonhomie and don't feel lonely. Farewell. I'm in good spirits and well prepared for whatever happens.
That house in Görlitz, where she'd spent her childhood, it still stands today. And my grandfather was deported in June 1942 to Theresienstadt. Theresienstadt, where that red arrow on the map points to, was a holding camp, a sort of large ghetto with enormous walls around it, and north of Prague. And he was sent there along with many others. And this is a picture of Theresienstadt from above, with its huge walls constructed in the 18th century. His sister Irma and his father-in-law Martin were also murdered there. But Hans, my grandfather, actually survived 2 years in the camp, which seems a miracle as he's blind. But I found that from articles that he was very popular there, known as the Professor, and he gave music lessons to other people who looked after him. But eventually he suffered lung disease and died on 19th of May 1944. He was one of over 33,000 people who died there, and one of 141,000 Jews who were sent there. Many others were sent on to Auschwitz for extermination. Now we come to the family that rescued my mother and uncle. I mentioned earlier that if that hadn't happened, I wouldn't be here today talking to you. On the left, Frank and Bee Paish, or Beatrice Eckard as she was originally known, the couple on the left. So she was the person my grandfather had met with my grandmother in 1911 while they were studying. And they paid the £50 guarantee that they could look after the children. Now Frank, who's standing up there, was a very famous economist, and in old age, he said that taking the Neumeyers children in was the best thing they ever did in their lives. Oscar and Doris in the car on the right looked after my uncle and mother when they first arrived in Weybridge, and the whole family became a sort of adopted family and lifelong friends. The older ones were called Aunt and Uncle, Uncle Oscar and Aunt Doris and so on. And the ones of the same generation were cousins. Oscar wrote to his mother just after the children arrived with them saying, "I think we shall all be happy together. They are tiny for their ages, with sweet faces and charming manners." And then in 1951, my mother married my father, Ronald. That's me in 1958 as a baby on the left-hand picture. And with my older brothers, Stephen and Nick. When I was small, my mother didn't explain for a long time, really, why her parents weren't alive anymore. And lots of my parents' friends had come to England as refugees. And being a refugee and having a horrible history behind you seemed normal. So I didn't really want to probe too much and ask them really what had happened. And I grew up in this house in South London, which reminded my mother of the house she had in Dachau. And it was full of German things, and we had German relatives visiting lots of the times. In the hall there was a bookcase with books which had all been sent over from Dachau after the war from friends who'd held on to some of the possessions. And in her bedroom, there's this photograph of her mother by her bed, and in another room there's a framed picture of her father with the dark glasses. And when my mother died in 2012, I started looking through her things in the house and realized she really kept everything. She'd lived there since 1956 with my father, and none of the letters had been thrown out at all. So I found lots of items that have helped with this story. And that story has been remembered because my mother returned to Dachau several times, including for ceremonies at the town hall in Dachau in 1988 and 2005 at the invitation of the town. And she also gave a talk to German school children in Dachau about her family's persecution under the Third Reich. She said she's very important. She really convinced them, I really want to talk to children of my own age when I was sent over, 15, and tell them what happened. And she really made a wonderful connection with them, I think. And in 2018, my brother Stephen and I were invited to the same school, and we also gave a talk to similar aged children. I'm as aware as she was as the need to remember World War II and the Holocaust are disappearing faster in living memory. But horrific examples of intolerance towards others are still very much current. I think of anti-Semitism and racial hatred are still very much rife throughout the world. And we only need to think something in the news this morning about the fate of the Uyghur Muslims being held against their will in concentration camps in China, which sounds very much like a genocide of Nazi proportions. But on the other hand, we also need to remember that a lot of people in Germany were not at all to blame. There were young men conscripted into the army against their will and presumably used as cannon fodder. And many people in Dachau and elsewhere were extremely kind to my family and to other people. Some friends in Dachau wrote to them often. The Storer family I mentioned earlier, who lived in Dachau, they used to leave food in fields for prisoners from the concentration camp who were forced to work there, but they had special hiding places for food. And one of the Storers wrote to them after the war saying this:
"Yes, dear, lovely Ruth, there is justice. God has rescued us from these beasts. It took a long time for our deliverance. During that time, the murderers killed so many people and brought suffering to us all. Please don't blame all the Germans. We couldn't do anything. We took no part in what happened. There are still lots of good people. Please write soon."
And there's my mother standing outside her birthplace in 2005 at the age of 82. I think she had mixed attitudes to Germany, but retained many friendships. I think her positive outlook was reflected in my grandfather's attitudes to life. And according to a pupil he had in Theresienstadt, my grandfather met his fate with acceptance, even with humour. The pupil sometimes glimpsed the strain on his face when he saw his teacher trying to read in crowded conditions. But he would always smile, put down his braille book, and give him his delicate, sensitive hand. And that unexpected calm of my grandfather was remembered by another pupil, a Yale professor called Elias Manueldis, who recalled one aspect of my grandfather.
I need hardly tell you the major role Hans played in my development in my student days. I owe to him the principle not to hate. I often think of his words that hatred can lead to negativity.
And finally, the items from that family's time in Dachau, the enormous amount of stuff I've inherited from them, is all going to the Imperial War Museum archive in London. And that teddy bear you saw right at the beginning of the presentation, that actually came on the Kindertransport with my mother, and it was saved and it's still there. It's now in the Imperial War Museum, waiting to go on permanent display in the newly remodeled Holocaust galleries from next year. So I'll leave you with an extract from one of the few compositions by my grandfather to have survived. Virtually everything else he wrote was destroyed in the war. If you're listening on headphones, you might need to adjust the volume because it might come out loud, I'm not quite sure. But this is a duo he wrote in 1940 for two friends of his. Okay, can I unmute now? Right. Does anyone have any questions at all? I'll have a.
I've got a question. Sorry,
Sorry,
Terry. That's Anne. Sorry, I seem to have not appeared. But I'm sure that's a bit of a relief.
I think if please unmute yourselves if you can. I can't unmute you all.
Yes. Your grandfather, was he blind from birth?
As I was saying at the beginning, he was partially blind at birth and had an eye defect in one eye, and then later on, because of a tussle he had with another boy at school, he lost the sight of the other eye. So from about the age of 13, he was blind.
Right, okay. And the other thing I wanted to just ask, I mean, I found it terribly moving, actually, the whole story. Why didn't they try and get out earlier? Or did they? You know, before your mother and uncle were sent on the...
I think that's
I mean,
very
wasn't
good
that impossible?
I think it's a very good question. I think they just didn't... First, they didn't really recognise there was a danger. They thought, oh, it wouldn't apply to us. And they prevaricated and they just didn't get their act together in time. And my mother always thought they're going to follow on. But I think it's happened to lots of other Kindertransport children. They thought, oh, my parents are going to follow on afterwards, but they didn't. There is a theory that both my grandparents were having affairs with other people at the time, which may have something in it as well. Ultimately, I think it's just a really tragic delay, and they didn't get things sorted out in time. My great grandfather, which is a chap called Martin Ephraim, so my grandmother's father, he was a patriotic German, and his son Herbert had managed to get away to America, and he tried to persuade his father Martin to come over with him. This was in 1937, I think. And Martin said, "Oh no, I'll live and die in Germany. I'm a patriotic German." And he'd say, "Germans would never do a thing like that." He was just in total denial. But they took him to Theresienstadt where he died anyway at the age of 84. So I think there's just disbelief that things couldn't be as bad, possibly quite as bad as that.
Yeah.
On the other hand,
actually. I went there when I went to Prague.
it's an astonishing place, isn't it? Yeah.
It is. It was very moving, particularly the schoolroom, actually, where the children, lots of the children who were there, their drawings and things like that. Yeah. Anyway, sorry. I'm sure other people have got questions.
Great. Any other comments or points?
Yeah, I wanted to say that I found it a little bit complicated to understand the relationship between your family and their Jewish ancestors. And particularly at the beginning, while they were persecuted, they were Lutherans, but they were persecuted as Jews. I think it would be good to clarify the whole Nazi policy on why Jews were being persecuted. So yes, they were identified as Jews, but you never actually get into what happened to the Jews and why they were being put in this situation. The whole idea of the Aryan ideal, and that kind of thing. So you don't really talk about that at all. And it's personally, I also wanted to know if ever, and so you said Hildegard was a Lutheran and she had the children brought up Lutheran, but at no point did anybody discuss the fact that the grandparents were Jewish, or was there no connection to Judaism? I mean, do you have any connection at this point to being Jewish, or is this all sort of a separate thing?
No, that's a good point. No, I don't have any connection myself. And I do find it a bit strange that my mother's grandfather, Martin, being the person who founded the synagogue in Görlitz, that she wasn't a bit more aware that there were some Jewish aspects there. And also her father, having come from a sort of 100% Jewish background, I never really got an answer why she didn't think she had any sort of Jewish background for such a long time, because I would have thought that there would have been something there. Now, as to the story about Hitler and Judaism, I mean, I was discussing it with the mentor who's been sort of training me, and she said, actually, you should really stick to this story more than rather than explain, for example, everything about Judaism, because it's
no, you don't have to explain everything about Judaism.
Because this is something children would have learnt at school separately. For example, I only touched on Kindertransport. I didn't go deeply into it. So as it was, I still went 5 minutes over at the end. So there's probably something else I need to take.
I just want to say one other thing, that maybe because of the Lutheran connection, or because they went to somebody they knew and ended up with a very happy family experience. If you're presenting to a school where they're not in the museum, so they haven't had the exposure to other materials, it would still be worthwhile talking about how your family, the experience that they had relative to other people on the Kindertransport, since this is the one talk they're going to hear about Kindertransport. Mm-hmm. And it is kind of a different angle on it than what the majority of experiences were. Even, they suffered, obviously, and that it's very moving the way you tell it, and the number of artifacts you have are incredible, and your mother's voice is very powerful. But I still feel like the context it still needs to be you're teaching about the Kindertransport, and you want to talk about the big picture a little bit.
Okay, thanks for that comment too. I'll note that. So that's a very good point. Thank you.
Yeah. Tim, can you hear me?
Hello, Jeffrey.
Yeah, I just, first of all, I sort of compliment you enormously. It was really wonderful. And what a treasure trove of artifacts you have. Quite amazing. But the point that the last person spoke, I absolutely agree with. I really got very confused as to why, who was Jewish in your ancestors' family, and why why the persecution followed. I really think that needs to be clarified. You don't have to take long, but you certainly need to clarify that, because I was thinking why. It was not made clear. And when you're talking to school children, I think it needs to be clarified. I think it'd be really helpful.
Okay, thanks.
That's enough.
So in that case, it was my grandfather Hans. He had two Jewish parents who I don't know very much about. Okay, so he had two Jewish parents, and that was a sort of solidly Jewish background, which I did explain at the beginning, actually. And his wife Vera's father was Jewish, but he'd married a Protestant woman, so that was why there was she only had two Jewish grandparents. I mean, I could do it with a family tree. I don't introduce too many people.
Yeah.
Sorry, Fern first, and then Mike. Okay.
Me.
Fern, yeah. Okay.
One of the things that's kind of interesting when you start talking about the Jewish background of your grandfather is that it's very similar to the way Black people in Southern America were treated. Somebody could be white and look white, but if they had one Black relative 3 generations back, they were Black. And I think it's something that can connect with young people to see how that kind of prejudice keeps on
that's a good one,
going.
Yeah.
And the other thing that's related to that, and this may have just been a slip of the tongue, but I caught it and it bothered me. When you described the fact that she married someone who was of the Jewish race, that really bothered me, because race has nothing to do with it. And considering Jews as a race is a big part of the problems.
Okay, yeah. Yes, I didn't realise I used that word. Sorry, it wasn't probably wasn't appropriate.
You need to be careful about that kind of little thing, you know.
Yeah, not Jewish race.
But overall, I thought it was very moving, very interesting.
Thank you.
Yeah, great.
Fantastic.
There's so many things you have to be careful of saying. You have to be careful not to say things like Polish concentration camps, because that really riles people in Poland. So not in Nazi-occupied Poland and things like that.
Ken, one very brief comment. At the age of 16 or 17, I did not know what the word Protestant meant. Genuinely did not know, and many people don't come from religious backgrounds. So it might help to explain what a Protestant Christian is compared to a Catholic Christian. Or
right, okay.
Very basic, because not everybody in the room knows these things, even if they've had religious education at school.
Probably, yes, that's true.
Yeah, that's true. This is with the heading of the presentation.
I did ask the mentor of this charity, should I have to explain what Judaism is about? She said, no, don't do that, because it's just too enormous. Okay, yeah. She said, just stick to the story and keep it very simple. And it's so easy to spread out and mention other people. But I'll ask her anyway what she thinks about Protestant Catholics. It must turn up elsewhere as well.
And you don't have to go forever on it, but exactly explaining that the Christianity has a variety of different beliefs.
Yeah, it's striking that my mother was actually, and the other Protestants were separated from the Catholics at school, and she said, well, they're a bit different, you know.
I can't help thinking that this would have been presented with an introduction beforehand of the political situation in Germany. And I think that this is just such a wonderful personal story. You don't want to get into too much explanation during it. I think that would be before this was presented as a personal story. And I think it's wonderful. Tim, thank you so much.
Thank you. I mean, it's something which I suppose would be tailored for the school or whatever institution is. That's, you know, they might say, these children or these students know a lot about this subject, or they've never heard of the Kindertransport. You've got to explain it from the beginning. But when so sometimes it's going to have to vary, and sometimes I'll have to take things out to fit it in. I think Jess, I think, was the next person. Then Mike. Sound out. So.
Mike.
Jess, are you still on?
Hello.
Oh, I'll try Mike in that case. Hi, Mike.
Hi, Tim. Yes, I did. I mean, I thought the presentation was very good, and I can understand why the charity has focused you into talking about the personalisation aspect of it, rather than the historical context and background. And I think it's up to the school to decide whether or not the children who are going to be seeing the presentation understand enough about Catholicism, Lutheranism, Protestantism, Judaism, and so on before they watch the presentation. But in terms of linking that back into why your family got into such a terrible position with the Nazis, a picture, an animated graphic of the family tree with a voiceover saying the Nazis would have identified this person as being a Jew, this person as being a Jew, this person as being a Jew, therefore that person was then identified as being a Jew, regardless of anything else. That would help to understand why those personal relationships flowed through into being identified as a Jew and then being persecuted, without having to go into all the explanations of what is Lutheranism, what is Catholicism, what is Judaism, and so on and so on.
Yeah. Thank you very much. And George, I think you had your hand up some time ago.
Yes. Yeah, I found it very enlightening. I think you did a great job. Thank you. Yeah, a couple comments is that not everyone was so fortunate when they arrived in England and were welcomed into such a wonderful family as your mother and uncle.
Yeah.
I spoke to a friend, my mother's friend Bertha, at one of the Kindertransport reunions, and she was actually abused by the person who took care of her as she was 17 years old. And my mother was sent to a boarding school in Broadstairs, she said, which was straight out of Charles Dickens, and they couldn't write letters home unless they finished their porridge. Some really bad, you know, distressful stories, and she was crying the first few months because her parents weren't there. So it might be helpful to say that my parents were, my father, my uncle, and my mother were fortunate to go into a loving family, but this was not always the case.
Yes.
Also, I was really interested in your overall graphic of Theresienstadt. I actually went there with my wife, my mother, and my daughter about 5 years ago, and as a survivor took us around Theresienstadt to show us the camp where my great-grandmother died and my aunts were. And it's coincidentally my mother's cousin, he was also blind, a World War I veteran, and he was in Theresienstadt. And he survived, and actually his wife gave birth in the camp and the child survived. So it was interesting to me that his guide dog was taken away. That was really poignant to me because I had that connection. I never knew what happened to my mother's cousin Fritz's German Shepherd, you know. So anyway, that was interesting. And also my mother has a cousin who's alive. She's 92. She grew up in Görlitz. And she's gone back to Görlitz several times on the auspices of the Jewish Museum Berlin and spoke to students there. And I'm sure she'd be happy to talk to you if you were interested. She lives in Berkeley, California.
I'm in contact with several people through Görlitz through the Facebook group for, I don't know if you're in it as well, but there are a small group of people connected with Görlitz.
Her name is Evelyn Apte, anyway. But anyway, yeah, I thought it was excellent because it was a different angle to have someone who had no real knowledge of being Jewish growing up, and then all of a sudden being ostracized in the class and having rocks thrown at them. Just seems like it obviously was, she went through a lot of trauma, and how it affected her growing up in England without parents, and how how she found out what happened to her family. And for me, I would talk about how that trauma is passed on to me as a second generation. Maybe it wasn't passed on to you, but I know even my children say that I passed on trauma to them by keep on telling them about what happened to my aunts and my great-grandmother and that kind of thing. But overall, I thought you did an excellent job, and I really don't think you have to change much.
Thank you, actually. That's a very good point about the Kindertransport. That they were incredibly lucky of the people that they ended up with. I've heard from a PhD researcher who's looking into refugee community in Cambridge recently, and he's very interested in my mother's story because she's got diaries from that period, and he said he's never come across a refugee in Cambridge with diaries. So we're going through those at the moment, trying to find things. But
I speak.
yeah. Anyway, sorry. Yeah, sorry. Petra got a finger up.
Yeah, Tim, absolutely brilliant. I have to say, fantastic. I actually found the why your parents, the Jewish connection, very clear, but obviously others disagree with that. But I'd also say a bit for school children that maybe you could mention, you know, Judith Kerr, that she was on the Tiger Who Came to Tea.
Yeah.
She was on the Kindertransport as well.
Yeah.
So I think she's someone that most children know. And also maybe after you had the, you know, the train coming to Liverpool Street, there is the statue at Liverpool Street Station.
Yeah.
That I think lots of people might have seen. So just a quick shot of that, you know, might put it in context that children might know about it.
Yes.
But and the only other thing I wanted to know, suddenly you really jumped ahead really quickly. So 1 minute your mother is 15, and the next minute she's married with 3 children. I know you had the Cambridge bit in between, but you didn't say how she met your father, when they got married, what your father did.
I must say that was kind of an afterthought to mention anything. I thought I ought to explain why I'm here and how I got here. Briefly, she was in Cambridge from 1940 to 48. Then she went to teacher training college and met my father there. And she studied art in Canterbury for a bit. But I thought that's probably not that important in the bigger picture of things.
Or maybe just a quick, I just think you're so vested in her life at that point in the talk.
Yeah.
That you suddenly wanted to know.
It was a big jump. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
I'll
see if anything I can link into that. Okay. Great. Was there anyone else?
Lisa.
Lisa?
Yeah. Can you hear me?
I can hear you and see you. Yeah, thank you.
Oh, good. A couple of things. I wasn't sure what age group this was designed for.
About sort of, well, it would vary. I was thinking of secondary children, probably age 16 or something like that.
Oh, okay. So the adolescent.
Yeah. I think that the youngest they learn about Kindertransport is when they're 13 nowadays at school. Not that I knew anything about Kindertransport when I was that age, but obviously I'd have to adjust the language a little bit first.
That's about the age of your mother.
Yeah.
On the transport.
Absolutely, yeah.
You might want to say that.
Yes, that's a good idea, actually.
And
I definitely would do because at the end of it, I mentioned her going back to school in Dachau, and she really insisted with the people in Dachau. Actually, there's an anecdote I haven't told, but it's in 1988. It was the 50th anniversary of Kristallnacht, and the town of Dachau invited her back to Dachau to a sort of town hall ceremony. And she said she was rather fed up with Dachau. It's very conservative, and they would not really acknowledge what had happened in Dachau at all. And she said, "I'm not going back unless you agree to 2 things. Firstly, that I get to talk to a class of school children who are my own age when I was thrown out. And secondly, you put up a plaque in the town hall commemorating the Jewish people who were thrown out that night, because Dachau always said, well, we didn't have any pogrom in Dachau, but they did throw out 12 families, and they refused. Amazingly, they refused at first, and then she only got them to agree after a wonderful German journalist called Hans Holzheider, who'd written a book about the families in Dachau, what happened to them, Jewish families. he actually was quite influential, and he said, look, you're going to do this. And they did it eventually. And she went back some years later for a much nicer reception in 2005, when they put the Stolpersteiner outside her parents' house. And I went back with my brother Stephen in 2018, and we had a fantastic reception in the town. And there was a very young go-ahead SPD mayor, about 28 years old, the youngest mayor in Germany, and they were telling us, Dachau, they were saying to us, Dachau was very right-wing some years ago, and they wouldn't acknowledge any of this stuff. Now everyone wants to know about it, and we're really pleased you're here.
It's
they were
nice
wonderful.
to know they evolved a little bit.
It was lovely. It was as well as that
there was some evolution.
Yeah, as well as that talk to the school children, we gave a talk in the town hall, which is absolutely packed. There are people outside, and there are film cameras and things, and journalists there, and it was like the first time we were giving a sort of public memorial to my grandparents who I'd never met. So it was really a fantastic occasion, and I was very pleased, and we made lots of nice friends in Dachau then as well. I
have one more issue, the identification. Can you hear me? Because my internet's unstable. Okay. Yeah. They're at the same vintage, these kids, as your mom, number one. Number two, if you have the teddy bear around and you haven't given it to the Imperial whatever,
it's gone.
Okay, forget it. Okay, I just thought that would be a nice addition to bring something. All kids can relate to a teddy bear.
I tell you what happened. I'd never given a talk about this until 2015. We had in the place I live in, Lewes in Sussex, England. We were doing they had a Holocaust Memorial Day presentation for the first time. So I thought, I come along to talk about just 10 minutes about Theresienstadt and what happens there to my family. And then I read out this letter from the train I was doing, and I also started off with that same photograph of the family with the teddy bear having a tea with a teapot and everything. And at the end, I said, "Oh, that teddy bear, by the way, it made it back, and here making his public appearance, his public debut. Here he is," and everybody clapped. It was a lovely moment. I wasn't quite expecting it, but the Imperial War Museum took it away, and they say they freeze dried it to get rid of any bugs inside. But they said, "Don't worry, the bear's perfectly all right." And they'll sort of see.
Oh my God. Okay, well.
So anyway, it's going to outlive all of us, that bear. So there we are.
One thing I wanted to mention, Tim, is that lots of people are saying things that maybe you should include or shouldn't include. When I sent you the email a while back, I mentioned that I'd been given a piece by a friend she'd written about Drancy and the transit camp on the edge of Paris that I found very cold. And one of the things I really liked about your presentation was the fact that you included voices, your mother's voice, a bit of your grandfather's music, the letters, all of that added really moving texture to the presentation.
Okay. Yes. By the way, did that music come out very loud at the end? Or was it all right?
Well, it was up and down a bit.
I deliberately tailed it off at the end, just to quiet it down. No, but I tried it earlier with my wife, and she nearly went deaf, I think. But no, it's nice, lovely having that music, and it's just a shame there's nothing else. There's a duo and a trio, and those tiny little childish recorded duets, and there's kind of nothing else. But he wrote loads of stuff. It all got burnt in Berlin. So it's just a fluke that his secretary, Dalo, was possibly more than his secretary, but she used to play the violin, and she must have kept those two bits of music somehow herself, and she ended up in Sweden in the war, and she brought them over to England in the 1960s sometime. So we had that connection. And then when I was clearing the house in 2012, my mum's house, I found this cassette tape with no label on it by the radio, and I thought, what's this? I played it, and it was that interview. I'd never heard it before. It's 45 minutes of it, and you can actually hear it on the Imperial War Museum website. The whole thing's there, and I've done a transcript of it on my blog page as well, on my blog, with a bit of more explanation. But that was lovely to hear that, and I wish there'd been recording of my uncle speaking. That's the only thing. But what I have got from my uncle very recently, it was about a year ago. My aunt, his widow, gave me about over 100 letters he'd written to my mother while a soldier in the war, mostly posted out in Germany. and they're really interesting. They're partly in English and some in German. My brother Stephen Ricks, who speaks much better German than I do, he's been helping translate them for me, and I'll obviously be writing about those at some stage. But they are really full of emotion, and it's a thing my mother never really said what she felt about anything, which has partly driven me on to research all this stuff. Is what actually went through. What was it like for her? Because I don't really know. And she's always saying, "Oh, it's perfectly all right. It must have been rather terrible then." And she is obviously, it was a survival mechanism, but she must have felt all sorts of emotions. And I wonder sometimes if she had a survivor guilt as well. But she was in Cambridge with very nice people and made loads of friends. And I don't know if she slightly forgot about her parents at one stage, but in her diary for 1945, September 45, her birthday, she finds out that her mother is almost certainly dead, and she didn't realise until then. They said that my mother was in a part of Poland from which there's very little news, and that's all we know. We never worked out where she's gone to. Only very recently, I've been looking at the evidence of what was in that letter written on the train and putting things together and looking on the internet, and I found that the train wasn't bound to a place called Piaski, where we always thought she was going to, but probably went to Auschwitz. But Auschwitz don't have any records either. They tell them they can't help. Everything gets destroyed, of course.
Tim, I was going to say, in terms of presentation, I loved including the audio clips and the music, because if I present sometimes, and listening to my male monotone for 45 minutes or whatever is terribly boring. So including some audio, some video every so often really enlightens and helps concentration. It's brilliant that you've done that. I will say that my father also was invited to Dachau. I like to imagine he was there at the same time. We have.
So I missed the last bit there.
I like to imagine that my father was in Dachau on the anniversary along with your mother, but it's possible.
Oh, really?
It's possible. It was only once he went to Dachau for that. He was invited by the city. I think I have a video recording of him talking.
I think said about that, yeah.
And again, my mother's grandmother was killed in Theresienstadt, so this, which isn't good, but happened. And I have several other relatives who were there as well. So,
the background, isn't it?
The story, as you said, because some of it is horrific for 15-year-olds, it's difficult to pitch it right that it doesn't.
Non-Jewish person.
It is a bit,
yes, my mother, who isn't around anymore, but she told me she died. My mother died this year in her late 80s, but she only told me 2 years before she died that her grandmother was murdered. Because people didn't talk about these things.
No, I mean, it is very hard to talk about it, and I only found out from my mother what happened by sort of accident. I think it's very hard to tell a child, look, you don't have any grandparents because they were murdered and stuck into a gas chamber when they're in the 40s or something. And, I only found
it was 2 generations. That's what the Nazis said.
Yeah, I only found out by accident when I was about 8 or 9 from another boy at school. We were playing some childish game of Germans against English or something, some war game or something. And one of his friends said, "Oh, I hate Germans." And then my friend says, "Oh, don't say that because Tim's mother's German and she came over on a Kindertransport from Germany." He obviously understood it. I don't understand where he'd picked up the story, probably through his parents who'd been speaking of mine. But that's the first time it really clicked how what actually happened. So I knew she came from Germany, and she sort of liked Germany, but she sort of didn't like it.
Mm.
Jeffrey, do you want to say anything? No, it's waving.
He's muted. You're muted.
Jeffrey, we can't hear you.
We've got to go.
Oh, you got to go. Okay.
Thank you very much indeed. It was really, really wonderful.
Yes.
Oh, golly, it's 7:30 now, yes.
I know.
That's fine. Thank you.
Take care. Bye, everybody.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.
I'll hang on a bit, but anyone who needs to go, that's absolutely fine. It's gone way over time. So Thanks.
Very good. Very good indeed.
Very good indeed. Thank you, Tim.
Thanks,
I thought the music clips, you know, particularly added to it. I think we had a slight difficulty with the volume on both of them, which seemed to go up and down a little bit here. But that's really a technical thing. It was wonderful to hear the music. It was like a voice from the past, and you know, I thought it was very engaging, very moving, very, very well done. Thank you.
Yes, that's actually my mother said to me, that this music's the one thing you can hear from your grandfather directly, which is nice.
Yeah.
Actually, one thing I've inherited from him is piles of piano music with their names written on it. You know, it's just Beethoven and stuff like that, and there's still music I use myself. It's quite nice. It's quite nice handling the same volumes.
Tim, can schools sign up to have your talk?
Yeah, I'm sure they can. Yes. Hopefully, when things get a bit easier. So I'd much rather give it in the flesh than do it on Zoom. But I suppose Zoom. Yeah, I don't know. With generation to generation, as the charity does it, they help find places to do it. But I've never, apart from going to Dachau once, I've never presented to a school. I must say the 16-year-olds in Germany were incredibly impressive. They asked really good questions at the end, and there were about 70 of them packed into a classroom, sitting windowsills and things. And afterwards, they all came around for a walk around town with us and polished up lots of Stolperstein around the place. It was really a great day.
I'm going to say thank you very much. I'm going to leave you as well. And yeah, very, very, very lovely. Thank you. Bye. Bye.
Thanks, Tim. I'm going to go as well. Good night.
I think we shall call it today. Thank you very much. Do email me if you've got any other suggestions or ideas, and I'm going to keep the comments. Look at the comments as well. And someone said, were the Kurbners also Jewish Lutherans? I've no idea. The Kurbners, this family, they stayed with in Munich, you remember, and I don't know anything about them, I'm afraid. So I don't know how they knew them or anything like that. My mother boarded a train in Cologne. I'm just reading some other comments that other put it. So someone says, Tim, have you journeyed to any of these places in Germany and the camp? Yes, I've been to Riesenstadt and Dachau. Strangely, Anne and I went to Dachau in 2001, and we went to see the house. And then we were using Interrailing, and we went up to Dresden, stay with some relatives, and then we went on to Görlitz, and then went down to Prague, and then up to Theresienstadt. And I more or less reconstructed my grandparents' final journeys. It's very, very, very strange, actually. I only realised it wasn't intentional either. And someone says, did your friends, Leon says, do your friends keep contact with the Page family? Yes, we did, very much so, and we're still in contact. So in fact, the last time I saw any of them was earlier this year. Anthony Page is a godfather of mine, actually, and that we know them very well, actually. And somebody says direct comparison with the Nazis with the Uyghurs is terrible. It's not appropriate. It's not the same. That's probably true. Yes. So we shouldn't say it's obviously an alarming situation of a sort of genocide. And that's probably she wouldn't. Yes, that should make the direct comparison. And lots of nice comments. Thank you very much. Let's see anything else.
Tim, when you were in Dachau, did you knock on the door of your mother's house?
Yeah, more than that, actually. We last time my brother and I and our partners were invited by the neighbour of my mother's, a person who lived next doors, who my mother knew had become a friend, and my mother had met him in 2005. He's a very nice psychologist called Jürgen and his wife, and we stayed in their house, and they gave me the bedroom looking directly onto my mother's house. I like that, and while they're there, they hadn't really explained this. They said, "Oh, we're going to meet Mrs. Meyer now, who's the owner of that building, that house. She's the landlady." So and it's all being inverted inside, so everything you couldn't get inside into the room. But it showed us into the staircase. So I was all taking pictures of the staircase, and she's then presented to this amazing bedspread, which has embroidered the picture of the house on it. And she said, "This is yours." So she kind of gave us the house back again, inside the hall there. So we did manage to get inside for a few minutes. Very memorable.
Do you know what happened to all of your family's possessions?
We don't know. Some of the books and sheet music came over, was kept by people after the war, and was sent over, I think, in a trunk or something. So we had some stuff. I kept some of the nicest books actually after my mother's died, and I kept a lot of music, nearly all the music, which was sent over. But there were lots of lovely paintings and artifacts which were just looted, I guess. I know the family would have had a lot of art, and they owned two grand pianos, which I think were kept for people for safekeeping. We never got them back or anything. We got a tiny amount of compensation from the German government in the 1960s after thousands of letters. I've got a huge dossier of letters from lawyers, and we got a few £100 back from them. And my mother rather brilliantly used it for really nice family holidays. And the first of one, which was actually going to Germany. We actually went back we went back to the house in Dachau and Knox, and we were allowed in. That was when I was about 8. We had some very nice family holidays for that money anyway. So
one last question. It was your uncles. Did your uncle have children, or are they interested in the story?
Yeah, he had 2 children. One tragically died as a teenager of cancer, and the other one, Tobias, I'm still much in contact with. He actually initiated a family tree. So he and Raymond, my uncle, put this family history together at the beginning, which has actually been really useful because there are lots of things about the family I didn't know, and that's helped me quite a bit. But strangely, he hasn't shown a huge amount of interest in ever going to Dachau or any of these places. And even when I spoke to his partner, he now has a child of his own, but when I spoke to his partner, she didn't actually, the first time I met her, and they'd been going out for quite a few months, she didn't know anything about the story at all. She never talks about it, so maybe he wanted to put it behind himself.
I thought it's interesting someone's mentioned Pastor Niemeyer's poem, and there's certainly some connection between Pastor Niemeyer, Pastor Hildebrandt, and there was another one that came to Britain, and so I think some of them went back and were persecuted by the Nazis. I think they're all part of a group of Lutheran pastors of Jewish background, and the family. Tim's great-grandfather, Martin Ephraim, who was married to the Lutheran woman, had connections in Berlin with kind of the part of the Lutheran church that was anti-Nazi, and I think there's an interesting story there. I think they were helping to get people out, but we haven't got any more details on that yet.
Yeah, well, there are quite a few leads to go on that. There was one person which is referred to in a document, someone who's again in this sort of Jewish Christian relationship, and he was running an underground movement for Jews in Berlin, but he got arrested and shot at Sachsenhausen. Pastor Hildebrandt was a sort of friend of my mother's in Cambridge. He was in Cambridge in the war, and my mother's absolutely really adored him and followed him a lot. He eventually married my parents in 1951. So he was always a very important figure in her life. The Niemeyer poem, I had noted down as something to read out at the end of that, because it's so appropriate. It's very, very well known to us, but and I don't think I'll have time to do it, but if it's there, and I'm aware of it, so it could be used. Okay.
I said a couple of things that I don't want to upset you, because your talk is wonderful, and obviously your family, you've done a wonderful job of explaining everything. The problem I have is, actually what I wondered, but it doesn't have to be part of this presentation, is have you done any background work on the attitude of the Lutheran Protestant community during the Holocaust. And were some of the things like your mother was turned away by her church when she went to ask for help, or your grandmother,
yeah,
about the connection, they were sort of stuck between two, they were stuck in the middle between the Nazis and the victims. They became victims, but there's this kind of unstated, they associated themselves with people who were also perpetrators. So how did they feel about that?
Yeah,
I mean, because the Lutheran Church, in fact, was not particularly well spoken and during the Holocaust. So
no.
Did they still feel pretty connected to the Lutheran Church?
Interesting. I it's not an area I know much about, so I don't know where to start with that one. But it's there was something. And my mother was obviously very religious during the war. You can see in her diary she's always talking about God and so on. And I wondered if something happened at the end when she finds her mother's died, and she may have been put off religion or something. But and as children, we were never taken to church or anything. There was a German church we very occasionally went to in London, but it was not, religion was not at all pressed on us in any way at all, and we were never really discussed it or sort of made to sort of get into it. And when she finds out that her mother's died, is almost certainly dead in some horrible camp somewhere, she just says, "I think I'll put my pen down before I drop it," and then she doesn't write in the diary for months afterwards. And after that, I think it's all sort of the attitude's changed about. And I wonder if that might have is her faith in some sort of way.
Can I just interject for a second?
What do you think, Stephen? It's my brother, Stephen.
Well, on the religious side, I think it was essential for Ruth at the time when she arrived, because it was a way of becoming part of a very obvious community, and particularly in Cambridge, the community of refugees based especially around the Lutheran Church, even if they weren't Lutheran themselves, was actually very powerful. And Pastor Hildebrand played a major role, I think, in turning this community into something viable and making people feel part of things and wanted. And I think Ruth reacted very positively to that, and she did indeed have a religious phase that lasted, I don't know, 5 or 6 years, something like that. But I have to say, when I had a religious phase at university, which for better or for worse didn't last that long, Ruth said, "Don't worry, you'll soon get over it." So she was really a pretty devoted atheist underneath. I've got a few comments to make. Perhaps I'll feed those in separately, because I'm in the huge disadvantage of knowing so much about the story as well.
Share them, Stephen.
It's almost too much, isn't it?
I come from a family.
My mentor is, I think there might be a bit too much material here for 16 or 17-year-olds confronting it for the first time.
Yeah, no, I don't think you should say anything in the presentation. I was just curious. I come from a family where my mother was the child of 2 Jewish parents, but her she had a stepsister from her mother's first marriage, who married somebody who was Protestant. And so what happened was that they had children and they were brought up Christian. And it was a very complicated story. But the problem was that the father-in-law of my mother's half-sister was very pro-Nazi, and he was a Protestant, which is like, I don't mean to say that applied to all Protestants, but it was a very difficult situation for her half-sister, because she, of course, was Jewish, but, it put people in the difficult decision to try to figure out who they actually identified with, and what did these religious affiliations, I mean, never mind what the Nazis said, who were they going to go to if they had a problem? So, like when you said your mother went, or your grandmother went to her church to see if they could help, and they turned her down. You wonder why. I mean, why wouldn't they be helpful? What was the reason? I mean, it's there's just so much more to these stories that you can't talk, you're not going to talk about to 16-year-olds, but it is interesting to know. I mean, maybe in a book, when you write it in the future, you'll write another book.
I think there is a story in there, and I'm pretty sure, and others will know much more about this than me, that there was quite a big divergence between the established Lutherans and the dissident Lutherans. The Neumeyers wing of the Lutheran Church was always very anti-Nazi indeed, but I think the established Lutheran Church, which is obviously scattered widely around the country, and particularly in northern Germany, was deeply embedded in German society. And I think for them, just to be anti-Nazi was just something they weren't up to, basically. I mean, the Catholics had much the same story to tell. There's even worse, if anything. So I think there probably was quite a big divergence. But the dissident Lutherans, I think, played a pretty active part. I mean, most of them came to grief, of course, eventually.
Right. Okay. That's interesting.
Very good. Anyway, lots of interesting things there. And I mean, Tim, I think there might be some material here for a wider sort of archive talk that could be offered as background material to some of the schools who are looking at all this, because there's obviously a lot of detail which we wouldn't have had time for within the hour.
No, but
which people might find interesting and might want to look into.
Yeah, it just goes on and on. Actually, the story gets bigger and bigger every time I look at it.
Okay.
Something else pops out.
One fascinating little vignette, I have to say, just for why we've got an audience, is how we've discovered from the letters how there was a family that gave a lot of help to Ruth and her family in Dachau before the war, before Ruth left on the Kindertransport. A family called the Wirschings, who are actually the family of a really quite famous artist called Aranka Wirsching. And they gave money and food and all sorts of things. And then after the family stayed in Dachau. The son ended up serving in the German army as a vet, actually looking after horses and the like, and was eventually captured by the British in Crete and carted off to a POW camp in Egypt. But there are lots of letters about how the Wirschings desperately begged Ruth for help with the British authorities to demonstrate that they weren't Nazis. So there was this flipping around of the networks of help from a non-Jewish, non-victimized family to a victimized one. After the war, the people who'd stayed in Germany and the established non-Jewish people were desperate to get help from the refugees, which I thought was quite fascinating, and they did. I mean, Ruth did what she could anyway, and eventually Anselm Wirsching, who was actually a childhood friend of Ruth's, got retrained by the British denazification camp at Wilson Park in sort of democracy and how it worked and the like, which was quite a big undertaking which the British government took after the war to kind of retrain the German elite so that it could form the basis of a functioning German society. Kind of hinted.
Yes, there are.
But that was probably enough for now, I suspect.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I think we should wrap it up there. But thanks everyone for listening, and we'll continue some other time. I have recorded this session, so we if there's anyone who's only seen half of it, or wants to see it again, or knows someone else wants to see it, I'll try to find a way of sharing it around. So otherwise, I think we could probably sign off there. Thanks everyone for coming anyway.
Thank you, Tim.
Thanks a lot. I don't know how to turn this off, but Anne will work it out for me.